As a matter of fact, some Americans outright claim that capitalism is evil because look at these billionaires. They're running everything. And as the saying goes, money does make the world go around. Welcome to Personal Finance Cat, where I share my personal take on personal finance. I've recently listened to the Peter Thiel interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. I gotta say, I really enjoyed it. It sent me down this rabbit hole of looking into Jeffrey Epstein and, of course, Bill Gates. Granted that there are a lot of other interesting topics discussed in that episode as well. But if there's one key theme that I took away from that episode is that OMG. There are so many things under the surface that you and I, as normal people, would just never have known. For that reason, I do appreciate very much podcasters like Joe Rogan and Lex Fridman who are willing and able to interview everybody and really make an effort to keep people informed. We live in a representative democracy, that is the US, and one of the key factors needed for such a democracy to work is that the constituency need to be informed. Simply put, you need to know what's going on in order to vote for the right representatives, such as the president. And the elected officials of such a government will have a huge impact on everything. I used to think that it didn't matter. My one vote is going to be buried in the millions of votes. America has been arguably the greatest country that ever existed and will be for the foreseeable future. And then I'll be dead. So who cares? But due to various personal circumstances, I'm starting to change my mind. Apologies, I digressed. Going back to the Joe Rogan podcast, it made me almost have a little mental crisis because it flipped my whole worldview upside down. I admire Warren Buffett, as many people do, and Warren Buffett is heavily associated with Bill Gates. So can I even trust Warren Buffett anymore? Well, you ask, what exactly did Joe Rogan and Peter Thiel roast Bill Gates on? Let me break it down for you. Number one, Bill Gates has a close association with Jeffrey Epstein. Even though it's a bit mysterious what exactly their relationship was like, the fact that Melinda Gates has been very vocal about this and cited it as a reason for their divorce makes it reasonable to assume that something fishy was going on between the two, that is, Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein. Joe Rogan thinks that Epstein was able to arrange extramarital affairs for Gates in a safe and discreet fashion, which is not easy for someone at that level of a profile. Peter Thiel has an even more quote-unquote evil conspiracy theory, which is that Epstein was able to use the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a vehicle to cut their divorce settlement by 90%. In other words, Melinda Gates was only able to get 1/10 of what she was supposed to get from the divorce, thanks to Epstein. Let that sink in for a minute. This high-profile and often highly praised philanthropic foundation was created only to avoid paying out the full divorce settlement. Number two, Bill Gates has done too much virtual signaling by dressing up as Mr. Rogers, doing all the quote-unquote saintly things, which actually makes it very suspicious. Allegedly, according to a New York Post article, link in the show notes, one of the reasons why Gates turned to Epstein was so that Epstein could potentially arrange for a Nobel Peace Prize for Gates through his connections. Apparently, Gates really wanted a Nobel Prize, and that's the one thing he couldn't buy with his money. In Rogan and Thiel's view, this quote-unquote whitewashing is ironic, considering the history of how the Nobel Prize was founded. If you don't know, the founder of the Nobel Prize, Alfred Nobel, created it to improve his reputation, tarnished by his association with explosives and death. After a premature obituary labeled him the, quote, merchant of death, end quote, Nobel sought to reshape his legacy by funding prizes for contributions to humanity, seen by many as an attempt to whitewash his image. In a similar fashion, Bill Gates and Microsoft faced a negative image due to aggressive business tactics, monopolistic practices highlighted by a major antitrust lawsuit, and accusations of stifling innovation during the company's dominance in the 1990s and early 2000s. So what Bill Gates has been trying to do since then is exactly what Alfred Nobel did, which is to whitewash his negative image. Number three, although not discussed in this episode with Peter Thiel, Joe Rogan is very vocal about being anti-big pharma. Considering Bill Gates' tie with big pharma and part of the mission at the Gates Foundation, Joe Rogan has criticized Bill Gates' involvement in vaccine programs, particularly with regard to the COVID-19 vaccine. Rogan has questioned Gates' expertise on health issues, arguing that as a businessman and not a medical professional, Gates shouldn't be a leading voice on public health. Rogan has raised concerns about Gates' significant influence over global vaccination efforts and expressed skepticism about the push for widespread vaccination, especially in light of debates about vaccine safety and efficacy. Okay, so those are the three major criticisms of Gates from Joe Rogan and Peter Thiel. Like I said earlier, hearing all of this was a bit earth-shattering for me. It almost makes me wonder, are capitalists just evil? Putting aside whether I believe these conspiracy theories about Bill Gates, because it's probably way too complicated and difficult for us to navigate and determine. I have no doubt in my mind that Jeffrey Epstein was pure evil. There's simply too much evidence to deny it. Just watch the Netflix documentary Filthy Rich, which is about Jeffrey Epstein's life and crimes, amongst which the one that got him indicted and convicted was procuring a child for prostitution and of soliciting a prostitute. The fact that so many powerful and or wealthy people were associated with him sends a chill down my spine. Is it really that in a capitalist country, as long as you have money, you can do anything, including staying above the law? And is capitalism causing this? Let's take a step back and discuss what capitalism is. Capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own and control the means of production, distribution, and exchange of goods and services. The primary features of capitalism include private property, free markets, competition, and the pursuit of profit. In a capitalist system, prices and production levels are largely determined by supply and demand, with minimal government intervention. The idea is that through competition and individual entrepreneurship, resources are allocated efficiently, leading to innovation and economic growth. Okay, so what about the alternatives, socialism or communism? Socialism is a political, social, and economic system where the means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned or regulated by the community as a whole, often through government control. Some key features often associated with socialism include, number one, public ownership of key industries or resources. Number two, redistribution of wealth to reduce economic inequality. Number three, social welfare programs such as universal healthcare, education, and pensions. Number four, emphasis on collective decision-making rather than profit-driven motives. Lastly, what is communism? Communism, as theorized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was intended to be the final stage of societal development, following capitalism and socialism. In this vision, the state would eventually, quote, wither away, end quote, as a government would no longer be necessary in a classless, stateless society. However, in practice, communist regimes have typically involved strong state control and central planning, with examples seen in countries like the Soviet Union, China in its earlier periods, and Cuba. Communism is distinct from socialism, though they share similar goals of reducing inequality and promoting collective ownership. The key difference is that socialism allows for some private ownership and market mechanisms, while communism advocates for complete public ownership and the abolition of capitalism entirely. As you can see from these definitions, there are no pure capitalist, socialist, or communist states existing in this day and age. Some may argue that Cuba, North Korea, and even some other Asian countries, including China, are communist, and even Wikipedia states so. However, in my mind, they're certainly not strictly communist, because they're neither classless nor stateless. And some, like China, does allow some private ownership of assets. The theory of socialism and even communism sounds pretty good on surface, right? No economic inequality, many key services are free, such as healthcare, education, and retirement, and decisions are collectively made. Well, except that in reality, it won't work, as it never did. There are several reasons. Number one, lack of incentives. Without profit or personal gain, People may lack motivation to work harder or innovate, reducing productivity. Number two, inefficient planning. Centralized control over resources can lead to misallocation, causing shortages or surpluses, unlike market-driven economies. Number three, power concentration. Centralized power can result in corruption and abuse, as leaders may prioritize their own interests. Number four, stifled innovation. Without competition, there's less incentive for technological or product advancements. Number five, historical failures. Countries that tried socialism or communism, like the Soviet Union and Venezuela, often faced economic crises and political repression. E.O. Wilson, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and Harvard entomologist, famously quipped regarding communism/socialism, quote, "Great idea, wrong species." After all, we're not like ants. We're okay with an egalitarian system. Our human nature, marked by competitiveness, jealousy, thirst for power, etc., will be channeled in a productive manner only if the right incentives are in place. And so far, capitalism seems to be the most aligned with those human traits. That being said, why do some people feel like things are not great in a capitalist country like the US? As a matter of fact, some Americans outright claim that capitalism is evil because look at these billionaires. They're running everything. And as the saying goes, money does make the world go around. As I mentioned earlier about Jeffrey Epstein, for the longest time, he was able to stay above the law and abused all those underage girls just because he had money and power. In comparison, the hardworking and law-abiding middle class and poor are left struggling to get ahead or even just to make ends meet. Oh well, I hate to break it to you, but in the socialist and communist countries, people like Jeffrey Epstein also exist. And their behavior may be even more rampant. According to an article from Newsweek, when describing the, quote, pleasure squad, end quote, for Kim Jong-un and his senior officials, here's what the article has. Recruiters were reportedly sent to scour the country for the prettiest women, who would then be recruited to the squad as dancers, singers, maids, and concubines to senior officials in the ruling Workers' Party, or WPK. The girls could often be in their early teens when they were taken from their family homes, and they would then be stationed at leaders' houses so that they could be available whenever they were called upon. But of course, Kim Jong-un's crimes include more than just exploiting underage girls. Human rights violation, suppression of free speech, execution of political rivals, nuclear threats and military aggression, starvation, and economic mismanagement are just a few examples. So it turns out maybe it's not the economic system that's to blame. Some people are just evil. And there could be a myriad of reasons for this to happen from a psychological perspective. When these people have money and power, which tend to go hand in hand, terrible things happen. I'm not saying that capitalism is flawless. After all, it is just an economic system. But it indeed has proven to work in many different geographic and cultural settings. Singapore is probably the best example that shows how a country can implement a good capitalist system that serves to overcome the various physical limitations of the country, such as being a small and isolated island with few natural resources. To conclude, in my humble opinion, capitalism is not evil, but people can be. Even though we think we have evolved so much since 550,000 to 750,000 years ago, when the Homo sapiens lineage started. Reality is that our human nature hasn't. Before I close, I do want to say that I'd rather give Bill Gates the benefit of the doubt. I can understand when a person reaches that level of wealth, there are very few things left that can still provide meaning. Leaving a good reputation behind is one of them, and Gates may just be trying too hard. All right, thank you so much for listening. Do you agree or disagree with what I said? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Bye for now.